seara, bine ați venit. Nu știu dacă se aude, așa se aude. Ne bucurăm că sunteți în număr atât de mare în această seară, alături de noi. Evenimentul face parte din seria Idei care schimbă lumea, inițiativă prin care UVT aduce la Timișoara voci relevante ale spațiului public contemporan. Dați-mi voie să amintesc sponsorii: Nord One, partenera evenimentului Raiffeisen, FilTM, Fundația Albert, Aquatim, Cărturești, editura Litera, partener media, Kiss FM, UVT Media Hub. Îi dau cuvântul domnului Marilen Gabriel Pirta, rectorul Universității de Vest din Timișoara.
Mulțumesc frumos! Bună seara! Good evening, everyone! Mă bucur să văd aula magna Universității de Vest din Timișoara plină, ca de atâtea ori, și pentru că astăzi avem un invitat special. Am obișnuit în ultimii ani să aducem aici, în această superbă aulă, pentru comunitatea noastră, pentru Timișoara, în general, minți luminate ale lumii, care ne-au inspirat, ne inspiră, ne ghidează și ne face să visăm frumos pentru viitor. După mulți laureați ai premiilor Nobel în diverse domenii, astăzi, în această seară, este un moment al unui laureat al premiului Pulitzer. Please welcome in our university Anne Applebaum. Thank you very much. Please allow me to take a seat.
Thank you.
She is an American historian, author, and journalist who counts among the world's most important chroniclers of autocratic system of government. She is a leading expert in Eastern European history. She has garnered considerable international attention for her work, in particular for Gulag, Iron Curtain, Red Famine, Twilight of Democracy, Autocracy Incorporated, each of which traces the mechanisms of authoritarian power. She has also received several prominent awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in 2004 and most recently the Carl von Ossietzky Prize 2 years ago. She's a staff writer at The Atlantic. She was a Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a member of the editorial board. She has also been the deputy editor of The Spectator. Her writing appeared in The Economist, The New York Review of Books, The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, among many other publications. First of all, how has your experience in Bucharest and Timișoara been so far? And what is your take on Romania?
So first of all, thank you so much for this incredibly warm welcome. I'm really, really pleased to be here. I've said this to you already, but I'll say it for the audience. I have been to Romania several times before. I was in Bucharest and Iași and a couple of other cities in 1989, before the revolution. So I think it was in the spring, early summer. And I came with another journalist, and we drove around in a dacha. And, you know, I was at that time living in Poland, which was also still at that time a communist country. And even by comparison to Poland, I saw how repressive Romania was. The police blocked us in various places. We had our bags searched at the airport. I mean, people didn't want to talk to us. And of course, it wasn't because they were unfriendly. It was because they were scared. And it's really wonderful to be in Romania. Again, as I said, I've been here a couple of times in between, but it's wonderful to be in a country where people aren't scared, at least not all the time. I'm really pleased to be in this big open university with students from all over Europe and all over the world. You know, it's a sign that Romania is is really integrating with the outside world. I mean, I will write something about Romania, and so I was pursuing particular interests in Bucharest, but I think maybe the conclusion that I came to is one that I would, this is not the subject of what my article will be, but it's one that I'm coming to the same conclusion in a lot of other European countries. Romania is a middle-sized country. It's by some standards small. I know you don't think like that, but compared to China, and in this world where we now see these great powers acting outside of the rule of law in their own transactional interests, and that now includes not only China and Russia, but in a different way the United States. It seems more and more important, and this was brought home to me over and over again by people I've speaking to, that the way that Romania protects its sovereignty and the way it protects its independence is by being integrated into Europe. And it's even more clear to me here than it is in Poland. If you want to remain Romanian, if you want to remain have your own self-determination and control over your own politics, then you'll have to the more you can be connected to the rest of Europe and the more Europe can express itself as an actor in the world, the better off Romania will be. Don't ask me about Romanian politics, I have no opinions.
Okay, we will discuss tonight about democracy, autocracy, and the world that is being announced. We will talk about enemies inside and outside democracies and about war and wars. Our discussion will be 60 minutes long and will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A. Now, one of the most important theses in your book, Twilight of Democracy, is that it's not poverty or marginalization that explain the attraction to illiberal leaders. Democracies, you said, do not fall only because of the masses, but through the betrayal of elites. And one can say that this has been happening since the beginning of history. A streak of betrayals and resentment that you speak about in your book is a political engine. What's new this time?
So this was a book I wrote that was published in 2019, 2020. And it was a book that was it was designed to solve exactly this problem because I'm somebody who, for many years, I was roughly speaking, an anti-communist. I wrote books about the Soviet Union. A lot of my friends were on what you would have called the center-right, Christian democratic parties, or the Republicans in America, or the Tories in Britain. A lot of the people I knew in Poland, some of you know that as I said, I was living in Poland in 1989, then I married somebody Polish, I stayed there, I haven't lived there the whole time, but on and off since then. We had the friends who, not all of whom, but who more or less shared our opinion that the fall of communism in 1989 was great, and that we were together, we as Europeans and as Americans would build liberal democracies and work together, in that direction. And about a couple of decades later, I realized that some of the people that I knew in multiple countries were no longer part of that project, that they had been enticed by more radical ideas, that they no longer felt, they were no longer, working to promote liberal democracy, and they had, it so happens that a lot of these people I knew became radical right thinkers, but actually something similar happened on the left as well. This was just to do with my friends. And so I spent a lot of time trying to think about trying to understand what had drawn them away. And of course, in looking back in history, you find this always happens. And in fact, if you read Aristotle, or if you read the Greeks or a Roman literature, the story of the Roman Republic is the story of a republic where people became attracted to Julius Caesar. The republic fell apart; it became an empire, and so this pattern of democracies failing because the people who are inside them lose their faith in the system, or they begin to find different projects, or they no longer believe in the story. This has happened over and over again. In fact, if you look at the people who wrote the American Constitution, if you look at what they were saying at the time they wrote it and how they were thinking about democracy when they wrote it, they understood this perfectly well. So they understood that, there's a famous quote from Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the founding thinkers of American democracy, who says, of course we know that one day a demagogue will come along and he will attract people, and we need to somehow guard against that possibility. And the American Constitution was actually written that the idea of checks and balances, of independent courts, and of institutions checking one another was built exactly to solve this problem. So this is nothing new. If you read the history of the 1920s and the 1930s, you find it's nothing new. You find the same story. You find the same people saying almost the same things about democracy that they say today. It's degenerate, it's divided, it's weak. Autocracy is strong and safe, and democracy is weak and divided. I mean, you can hear people saying that in Mussolini's Italy. You can hear them saying it here. Actually, I think in that book I have some passages from Romanian writer Mihail Sebastian, saying exactly this. And he had almost this experience that he was somebody who had sort of far-right friends who became more radical. And he was also trying to understand why this was. And I don't have a comprehensive explanation. The people who I knew were often one way or the other disappointed. The society wasn't what they expected. It wasn't living up to their standards. They had hoped for, in the case of post-communist countries, they had hoped for something better and wealthier and more prosperous. The speed of change wasn't fast enough. The society was corrupt. In the United States, you found people after the Cold War, in particular, people on the right found politics boring. The Cold War was exciting, especially towards the end. We won, and this kind of feeling of cultural triumph. And then after the Cold War, what were we doing? We were fixing the roads and fixing the healthcare system. And for a lot of people who had joined the right or who had identified with that movement, with that part of the political spectrum, for kind of cultural reasons, they found the reality of politics boring. And that happens in other places too. There's also a way in which the extremism or radicalism offers people a different way of getting into politics, a different way of writing books, a different way of attracting attention. And it's almost like there are sort of political entrepreneurs who see this as an opportunity and a possibility. And there's a tendency now often to say that this is some kind of East European problem. Why are all these East European countries, falling into the trap of, authoritarian populism? I mean, this could not be farther from the truth. We are watching this right now in the United States, by some measures, depending on how you count, one of the world's oldest democracies, maybe the oldest. Depends what you think Britain was in the 18th century. And it's every society is subject to it, and the nature of modern social media, maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, also makes it easier. It's much easier to quickly create new political projects and movements than it was. So it's almost inherent within the system that there are people who look for ways around it.
Let's speak about anger. which is present today. At least many Romanians are saying that democracy does not work. And they speak sometimes justifiable about corruption, about poverty, about the lack of opportunities in their country, about how politicians are and their lack of vision. And sometimes the reaction can be fatigue or cynicism or revolt or radicalization. Young people in Romania are seeing elections are an opportunity to show their contempt for democracy by voting for people who don't ever claim to have political opinions. We have a party that is now in the parliament. We never heard of it, the party of young people, for instance. Do you think that this extreme polarization is a cause or a symptom of the decline of democracy?
I mean, I suppose it's both. I mean, you know, when you elect extreme parties or people who don't do politics, then you make you build the cynicism worse. I mean, let me say a couple words about the way in which people now get and process political information, because that's part of the story too. You know, it's important to remember, you know, when you go online, when you're on TikTok, when you're on Instagram, when you're on Facebook, you have the impression, and especially if you're interested in politics, because of course you can look at cat videos or something else on there as well, you have the impression that you're engaging in a free conversation. You know, you post something, someone responds to it, and you're somehow involved in the public sphere. Except that, in fact, what you're really doing is engaging in a manipulated conversation. So an engineer in California has written a computer program that will decide who sees your post and how many people respond to it and how widely it travels and where it goes. And these algorithms are not written to encourage good debate. That's not the point of them. And they're not written to encourage people to have fact-based conversations. They're written to keep people online as long as possible. You know, so they make you excited or angry or divided, or they show you more and more of what they think you want. They're written to keep you online, and sometimes they're written to make you buy advertising, you know, and sometimes in a few cases, you know, in the case of some of the platforms, well, especially X, sometimes there are political biases in the platform as well. You know, what this means is that people have, there's no longer a single political conversation. So we don't have a shared basis of facts or a shared reality that we can debate and discuss. And this is probably the biggest challenge for modern democracy, because if you think about what democracy is, when it works, you know, you have people discussing real problems, whatever, the healthcare system, or should we build a new road or a new bridge, and they discuss the problems based on a shared understanding of what that problem is, and then they come up with a solution to that problem. And we now live in a world where people don't share that reality. You know, they have different, it's not even about having different opinions, it's about having literally different perceptions of what reality is. And you have, instead of debate and instead of an exchange of ideas and a solution, you have more and more politicians who play to the prejudices of the people in their filter bubble. And this also creates something else, which is a kind of cacophony. So there's a lot of noise, and people hear lots of different things and views all day long. And very often the reaction to cacophony is people step back and say, everybody's lying, everyone's contradicting one another, I don't know what's true, I better just stay home. Politics is dirty, politics is for, they're all lying, and I better stay out of it. Or I'll just vote for a joke party, or I'll vote for, someone who, makes me laugh, and this is of course actually, if you look at authoritarian countries, this is actually an authoritarian tactic, to confuse people, to send out lies, to send out contradictory information. This is what Putin does, for example, in Russia. And when people see all these, this noise and contradiction, their reaction is, I'm going to stay home. And so it's really important that people learn to, that we find ways of getting, especially younger people, to engage in real politics. And that means real conversations about actual problems that have solutions, and not kind of existential culture wars.
We understand why it's happening in Russia, but we cannot understand why this happens also in the United States. I mean, you said that there used to be just one national debate, one conversation due to old newspapers and broadcasters. In Romania also the public agenda is hijacked by populists and demagogue, and Russia also. But some people can say that this official conversation was rigged by deep state or government or corporate media, or at least President Trump does that. He said, don't trust old corporate media, trust something like alternative media. Why this is happening in the United States?
So President Trump, so to be clear, the United States is a democracy. We have free speech. People engage in politics. It's not a dictatorship. But President Trump is somebody who has, either instinctively or through following other models, does use some of the tactics of the authoritarian world. And he is somebody who seeks to create his own reality. And so he, obviously, it's not actually just newspapers, and it's not just so-called traditional media. It's also universities, it's scientific institutions. He's built a government of people who all see some value in undermining trust in these kinds of organizations, in order to better build their own alternative world, and in order to serve an alternative audience. And yes, I've written about this. It is extremely dangerous, and it is like what authoritarians try to do. And why do they do it? They do it as a way of seeking to stay in power indefinitely. I mean, it's really no different from any other elected leader who then seeks to undermine institutions. I should say that if you look around the world over the last 2 or 3 decades, when you see failing democracies, most of the time they're not failing because there was a revolution or a coup d'etat, or some violence. Mostly they're failing because legitimate elected leaders come to power and then seek to take over the institutions of the state. And it almost doesn't matter whether they're right-wing or left-wing. If you look at what Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, and you look at what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, I mean, the patterns are different and the language is very different and so on, but the institutions they were aiming at are the same. It's about making the courts, politicizing justice, having, instead of rule of law, having rule by law, meaning the law is what the person in charge, in power, says it is. It's about undermining media and sources of trust. Very often it's about creating secrets, a lot of secrecy around the presidency or around the leadership, in order to hide what really goes on at the executive level. And all of these things are, as I say, they're stories that we know from other places. And Trump and some of the people around him have learned from watching that happen in other places, and they have come to, he was elected the first time, and during his first term he didn't have a plan to do this. I don't think he had thought it through. And the second time he was elected, it's not so much him, but it's people around him who did have a plan. And they did come to office with the idea that they would begin to dismantle some American institutions. That doesn't mean that they will succeed. And
they are the elites that you are talking about, who betrayed the liberal values, those guys around?
You can call them that, yes. I mean, nowadays everybody's an elite. I mean, it's whoever you don't like is an elite. So I'm reluctant to use that word, but no, there's a member of the administration who came to office seeking to, for example, to dismantle as much of the civil service as possible. And at least in America, the civil service, at least dating back to the late 19th century, has been a very important neutral institution most of the time. In other words, no matter who was president, Democrat or Republican, there were certain kinds of civil servants who always stayed there. So, I don't know, experts in pollution who knew how to measure the air pollution levels, or people who worked at the Food and Drug Administration and could test drugs, whether they're safe or unsafe. You know, these kinds of people, government scientists, government experts, they didn't have a political role. And they've been there, as I said, since the 19th century. We have this tradition of a neutral civil service. And one of the things that the Trump administration has tried to do is to displace and undermine the civil service and replace people like that with political figures. And this of course, will eventually, over time, lead to bad government, and but it's also a way of giving the president and his team more power over policy and over over the government. It means that the government becomes politicized. Even what should be neutral jobs become politicized. I mean, one other, when people think about democracy, they often think about elections, right? And parties and the electoral process. But actually, another important part of democracy is some kinds of neutral institutions. Like, you actually can't have democracy unless you have a level playing field and unless there's some parts of the state that are not political. Judges, obviously, at least in theory. Some kinds of civil servants, the electoral commission itself, or, in the United States we have 50 different, each state has an electoral commission. The electoral law, some of this has to remain neutral in order for elections to be fair. And it's when you politicize those neutral institutions that you're at risk of losing democracy. And there are people around Trump who are trying to do exactly that.
You mentioned Orban. Let's go to our neighbor. Why the idea of a strong leader continues to have a hold in a society that lived through communism, and not only? Why the Hungarian people vote for Orban, knowing that they lose democracy and freedom?
Actually, in the case of Orban, they don't just lose democracy and freedom. The Orban has undermined the Hungarian economy. So, relatively speaking, Hungary has grown less than a lot of its neighbors. On a lot of indexes, Hungary is, I think, by some measures, the most corrupt country in Europe. I know there's competition, but it's ranked sort of on all these measurements of governance and how good the government is. It ranks very low. He's made Hungary less prosperous than it should be. So people have paid a very high price. I mean, why do people vote for strongmen? Why are they attracted to authoritarians? I mean, this is back to the original question. I mean, my best explanation for this is not about elites, it's about voters. My best explanation is that, look, we live in a time of unbelievably rapid change. So, we get used to it very fast, but the fact that our telephones determine what we know, that wasn't true even 10 years ago the way it is now. We had rapid economic change. We're about to have another wave of rapid change connected to artificial intelligence. Very rapid social change in morals and the way people relate to one another. Very rapid demographic change in a lot of countries. Very rapid integration of people. Very rapid change in what we know. We now know things about foreign countries and about, kings and princes in other places and celebrities around the world. And, there's and people have this very strong sense of loss of control, and also, everything's changing so rapidly, I'll be left out or I won't have a role. And I think this has created a lot of nostalgia for what people imagine to be a better and more stable time. And this is often imaginary. You know, if you went back actually to that more stable time, you would discover it wasn't as nice as you think it was. But the idea that there was a romantic past where things were better and everybody knew one another and is very appealing. And I should say, if you're from a small town in southern Poland, or you're from, a small, rural community in Ohio, in the United States, it is true that the place that you came from has changed enormously and maybe unrecognizably, and that things are very different. And I think for a lot of people, the change they've experienced in their lifetime is disorienting, and they look for some kind of stability or some sense of safety in their politics. And that's my explanation.
Let's talk about the apocalypse.
The apocalypse.
Yes.
Okay.
So I quote from your books. Steve Bannon, we are going to have to go through dark days to get back to the blue morning sky in America. We will have to go through massive suffering. Anyone who doesn't think we need to go through pain, believe me, will be fooled. Alexander Dugin, we are conducting an eschatological military operation, a special operation between light and darkness at the end of the time. Truth and God are on our side. We are fighting against absolute evil embodied in Western civilization. Now, is this far-right millenarianism, far-left nihilism? It is populism, cynicism, paranoid politics, as Hofstadter said. Why this discourse is so present in Romania also? Because during the pandemic and now today, people talk about the sovereignist, the good one, Trump and Putin, and the evil, Soros and Gates. It is the great battle between good and evil. How come that this topic...
So you said Soros and Gates.
Yes, yes.
Right.
They are the globalists, the bad. And the good one, like in Tarantino movies, are Trump and Putin. So we heard that during the pandemic in Victoria Square in Bucharest, against the vaccine and all the things. How come that this speech is so present nowadays?
There's a very famous essay by the British writer George Orwell, and it's actually a book review, and it's a review of Mein Kampf. It was written during the war. It's very short. You can find it very easily on the internet. It's just a few paragraphs. And it's a really interesting review. He describes the book and what's in it and Hitler's ideology. And then at the end he says, unfortunately though, Hitler has also understood something that is hard for we social democrats to understand. By that he meant him, his milieu in England. We are concerned about good governance and health and hygiene and matters of government. And Hitler is speaking of, I think the expression he uses is guns, flags, and loyalty parades. That there's an appeal to deep emotion, to religiosity, to some kind of spiritual need. And that he sees that, and we in the world of people who are just trying to make the country work better, we need to understand how we can also help people fill those those spiritual needs. So we need to find a way to offer people some kind of patriotism instead of nationalism. And so there is something deep in human beings that we all want to be part of some kind of crusade or cause. We want to see some meaning in our life. And I think at a time when churches are, in most of the world, are declining, and when people feel this lack of meaning in their life, sometimes they look for it in politics, and some politicians are seeking to offer it to them. And it's much more fun to think that you're in a crusade against globalism than it is to think that you just want everybody to be healthy and survive the pandemic. I mean, That's to be the bureaucrat who has to be in charge of making sure everybody in Romania gets vaccines so that we don't get sick. This is a technical task that requires, mundane way of thinking. But to crusade against the vaccine because it comes from the modern form of the devil, it builds more excitement and energy. I mean, that would be my experience. It's hard for me because, of course, I don't find that appealing because my brain wants everybody to be healthy and survive the pandemic. But I see that for some people, this more existential language is attractive. And I should say, actually, it's incumbent upon George Orwell used the expression social democrats, but we now talk about liberals or centrists or people who want good government. It is incumbent now upon people from that part of the political spectrum, also to find a way to create new narratives and to inspire people. Mm-hmm. And to, maybe we don't have to battle the demons or, fight the devil, but it's not going to be enough to rest on the status quo and just say things are fine the way they are. I always have this conversation with every time I meet a liberal or centrist politician. We talk about what is the way to inspire and move people from the position of freedom, democracy, and good governance.
And speaking about this moral crusade, because you mentioned Margaret Thatcher as having a victory because she discovered this moral crusade, and John Major not. Now President Trump is on a moral crusade in this war against Iran, speaking about evil all the time.
So the war against Iran is actually a little bit stranger than that, because in fact, Donald Trump did not sell the war in Iran before he began it. So he didn't tell Americans that he was going to war. And usually if you think about how dictators use wars, or not even dictators, democratic leaders have also used wars, to build, to create a sense of national unity. We're fighting somebody against somebody else. He actually did not do that. He didn't talk about the war beforehand. If you remember when George W. Bush, before he launched the invasion of Iraq, he actually made the sale to the American people. This is why we need to do it. He had his Foreign Secretary, Colin Powell, present a case to the UN.
And the Congress approved.
He asked for approval from Congress. Congress voted for it. He made an international case. He had allies, who were with him, the British and others. And he built a case for why this is necessary and why we should pay this price, for this war, why Iraq poses a danger. And aside from whatever you think about the war and what his reasons were, you can't deny the fact that he did this. Trump did not do that. He did not get public approval. It's the least, by comparison to other wars, if you look at the first 2 weeks of any other war, they almost always had popular support, and this one doesn't. I think World War II had like 95% support. I saw some statistics the other day. This one doesn't. This one is much lower. He didn't do that. He didn't get approval from Congress, and he didn't try to bring in allies, other than some allies in the Gulf. And so in that sense, it's a much stranger war. It hasn't been explained or justified. And it feels almost like it's a project that Trump is interested in for his personal reasons, because it's of interest to his, he has business partners in the Middle East. His sons have businesses in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates. He has a close relationship with Netanyahu. I'm not saying Netanyahu forced him to do it. That's not how the relationship works, but he seems to have had his own reasons. He may also have been convinced that it would be easy. He had this experience in Venezuela where there was, I think partly because of advanced negotiations with some people in the regime, they extracted Maduro very fast, and it was over in a few hours, actually. And he may have thought that Iran would be like that. I mean, in that sense, it's, it may even be a problem for him politically, and it's already beginning to be.
I found interesting this, I told you last night, Timothy Snyder, a good friend of yours, thinks there are two reasons for Trump's engagement in this war against Iran. One, a foreign war as a mechanism to destroy democracy at home, and second, as an element of personal corruption by the President of the United States. Do you think that they are reasonable, these arguments?
The only thing I would say that is wrong there is, this is very hard for people to accept when you talk about the President of the United States, but Donald Trump doesn't think in terms of strategies, even strategies to destroy democracy. He doesn't have a long-term vision of what will happen in Iran, what the side effects of the war will be, what it will do to energy markets, what it will do to other parts of the world, how it affects the war in Ukraine, which is a really interesting part of the story. He thinks in terms of short moments. Actually, Ivan Krastev, another writer from this region, wrote a piece just today that I read a couple of hours ago, in which he points out how strange Donald Trump's sense of time is. He doesn't think about what happened before he became president or what will happen afterwards. He's not interested in the long-term future of Iran. He's interested in how the war affects him now and how it, and so it's trying to interpret it as part of some huge strategy. You miss the point. I mean, he actually thinks differently from, I can't think of any other, certainly no modern president that I know of thinks the way he does. In this, is it good for me? Is it good right now? What will it do? I think probably, there may be some business influences. As I said, he has these business connections in the Middle East. But I wouldn't see it as part of some grander strategy. I mean, the tragedy for me, I've had a number of friends in the Iranian opposition for a long time, in the Iranian democracy movement, human rights movement. And the tragedy for me is that it doesn't seem that they were consulted. They haven't been part of the decision-making process. They aren't part of the conversation about how the war will end. And that seems to be a great mistake. So even the Iranian people don't seem to be at the center of his interests.
Let's talk about supremacists in the United States and Russia. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. It was written on a MAGA hat. For some Americans, Trump is the new Moses. And the 2 weeks ago...
I hadn't heard Moses.
The 2 weeks ago photo of America's religious leaders praying in the Oval Office with Trump in the center was quite something. Evangelical Christianity became a political religion in the United States. Orthodox Christianity is a political religion for a long time in Russia. Do you think that these two movements communicate, are in some sort of anti-democracy barricade? Guys like Dugin, Bannon, Curtis Yarvin, Buchanan, Trump and Putin?
So it's clear to me that the MAGA movement, which is not a conservative movement, it's a radical movement, has a kind of internationalist, ironically, okay, since they're nationalists, they have an internationalist agenda, and they look for partners around the world. As does the Christian nationalist movement in the United States. They look for other Christian movements and groups who they can be in conversation with. The MAGA movement also, a little bit like, Lenin thought that the Soviet Union could only survive if it was surrounded by other communist states. There's a little bit of that too, that our movement will survive if we have other people like us. And so they are interested in promoting their contacts and friends, they're mostly interested in Europe and a little bit in Latin America. And they are interested in having links with kind of people who they perceive to be like-minded. And they make contact with them. It's hard at this point to see how serious it is, Because, and there is, of course, again, there's always something contradictory about internationalist nationalists. You know, sooner or later, they discover they don't agree. I once read a very funny article, which actually now I can't remember where it was, but the anecdote that was very striking, it was about the Italian far right and the Austrian far right, and they had some kind of meeting, and they were toasting, and we agree, I don't know, we hate Europe, we hate immigrants, I can't remember. You know, of course, then they start talking about South Tyrol, which is, some of you will know, is sometimes it's been Austrian and sometimes it's been Italian. And, you know, then they couldn't agree and they came to blows, and, you know, and it's so obvious that these kinds of movements will come into conflict. I mean, you know, I know very little about the relationship between Hungarian nationalists and Romanian nationalists, but I can imagine they would have some disagreements, right? So, you know, and so, you know, and so there's always this. It's a fundamental problem with creating an international movement of nationalists. I mean, I would, and this is related to the first thing that I said when we started talking. I mean, there is one deeper element here, and the deeper element is that there is in the United States one of the MAGA movement and the Trump administration have many different strands. There's a kind of Christian nationalist strand. There's a, you know, anti-big government strand. There's a libertarian thing, and there's also famously there is a kind of tech authoritarian strand. And they're not all of Silicon Valley and not all technology companies, but some of them have a lot of influence on the administration and a lot of interest in what it does. And the American tech companies, especially the internet platforms, do have an interest in undermining the European Union. Why? Because they understand that the one body in the world that can regulate them is the European Union, you know, the European Commission. And they understand that, you know, and it's therefore in their interest to promote the interests of, or maybe through funding, but certainly through online promotion of European far-right parties who are anti-European. You know, because if they come to power, then that will weaken Europe, and that will be good for them. And so that element is real, and that's part of what you're seeing. The strange thing is that, of course, at this exact moment, it's very much in line with what Russians want, for different reasons. You know, the Russians also want a weak Europe, because they think that a weak Europe would be less able to defend itself, wouldn't be able to defend Ukraine, would also be less able to resist Russian corruption and Russian business influence. So so you have these two groups who really are interested in weakening and undermining Europe, and they're all looking for partners here, not just here in Germany and you know, in France and everywhere else. And so you have a strange moment where there are forces both in America and in Russia who have that interest and will seek to influence politics in that direction.
Yes, it is maybe the first time that we have some kind of coalition against Europe. I mean, Russia, for obvious reasons. We had Nigel Farage and so on during the Brexit against Europe. And now we are looking at Trump attacking Europe, not only at Davos. So do you think that there are only commercial reasons, or maybe Europe will be the only superpower maybe, who will speak about human rights in the future?
So again, I'm generalizing because this doesn't apply to everybody in the administration or everybody in the State Department. But yes, I think there are people inside the movement more broadly who dislike the fact that Europeans still talk positively about liberal democracy, that they support the idea of rule of law and rights. And those are things that they're seeking to undermine in the United States. And again, as I said, like Lenin, you know, these are radicals, and like Lenin, they think they'll be safer in a world where more people agree with them. And so yes, I think there is an ideological element. Doesn't explain everybody, and as I said, it doesn't cover every American official. And actually, let me add one level of nuance, which is that at the same time as you have, you know, I don't know, Elon Musk and some people in Washington, you know, fulminating against Europe, if you ask right now any American general or admiral, just any senior person in the American military, if you ask them about their plans, what is your plan for X or Y contingency, all of them will start by talking about allies. And all of them have been, all of their whole careers, they've been exercising with European allies. And with British, with Romanians, with Poles, they're used to thinking in terms of alliances. I mean, there have been recent exercises actually in the last few weeks in Scandinavia. All of this kind of structure of NATO and of the intelligence relationships and the military relationships, all of that continues, as does all of the trade between Europe and America and all of the other kinds of cultural exchanges and tourism and back and forth. And I'm sure there are Americans at this university and there are Romanians in American universities, and all of that goes on. And so don't think that the arrival of this, radical movement at the top of society necessarily means everybody in America. It's a very complicated, big country, and there are a lot of, there are a lot of aspects to it, and that will go on, and that deeper layer of connection, I really hope will stay and will be there for us a few years down the road.
You said that there is no liberal world anymore, and the aspiration to create one no longer seems real. In Davos in January, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney warned that the old world order is not coming back. So, is this new international order, if any, structured by ideologies, by national interests, or by autocracies and kleptocracies? What kind of world is ahead of us?
So I think, that Mark Carney is right, and I did say it before him. Anyway, joke. It wasn't very hard to see. We are at the end of a period when, you could automatically cite international law, and that would mean something. And we are in a period of when more raw power matters, and when the larger countries will seek to bully smaller ones. And we can see that happening. It really actually started with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was completely illegal, and in the course of doing it, Putin has, I think, deliberately sought to defy international law. Convention on Genocide, this kidnapping of children. This is these are really egregious violations of the system, and I think that was on purpose. I mean, Putin wanted to show that the law doesn't work anymore, and he wanted to demonstrate that to people. And so, yes, we live in a world where Putin and now Trump, in some ways, are also seeking to defy these rules. And the question is, where does that leave smaller countries? And again, we're back. I'm now going to repeat myself, I think, for the third time. Smaller countries need to think about how they can combine, work together. This is exactly what Mark Carney said. He called them middle powers. Will need to work together to ensure that their interests are not overrun in this new world. And that includes not only Europe, it includes Canada. Maybe it includes Brazil. Maybe it includes the Mercosur countries who are now doing a deal with the European Union. Maybe it includes India. So slightly small, not that India is small, I should, but middle-sized powers will need to cooperate together to make sure that they, that their interests are looked after. And so, it's a world which is we know very well from history books, where more powerful countries seek to dictate the rules and dominate smaller ones. And the smaller ones, if they want to survive and, as I said, retain their sovereignty, will have to work together.
If we look at the leaders who speak about the new multipolar world, like Putin, Xi Jinping, Lukashenko, Erdogan, Orban, and so on, we see control over citizens, over media, NGOs, rewriting history, engaging in wars against neighbors. They talk about the rights of their states, but not the rights of their citizens. Do you think this new world, multipolar world, is going to be one which human rights will no longer matter?
I mean, human rights always matter, and they matter even in dictatorships, because human rights is something that people feel intuitively. So, why is Putin so anxious to disqualify the language, not to use the language of human rights or to mock the rule of law? And why does he does it because he sees that it inspires his opponents. Very often, I've met many people over the years who were dissidents in very repressive countries, and many of them came to their belief in the importance of fighting back, or the importance of rights, or the importance of rule of law, not because they read a book about Thomas Jefferson, or even Václav Havel. They understood that it's unfair that that some people have rights and other people don't, and they understood that it's unfair that the powerful and connected get justice and other people don't, and so there will always be a push for the respect for those rights, because it's something that it's part of many world religions, actually. That certain Christianity has this, imagine everybody has a soul, and everybody therefore has some rights, and everybody has a reason to be, and so those are very instinctive feelings. So no, it's not going to disappear. It may be that the culture of human rights activism as we knew it, and the role of international institutions, that begins to change, that it just doesn't work as well as it used to. But I think people will find other ways of pushing for the recognition of rights in individual countries.
Russia's war against Ukraine has entered its 5th year. How do you think this war will end, and what would be a just peace for Ukraine now?
So the war can only end in one way, and the war will end when Putin understands that he can't win, and that means that he can't destroy Ukraine as a nation, that he will not overrun Ukraine, he will not create a fake government in Ukraine, he will not absorb Ukraine into Russia. And when he gives up that goal, which has been his goal from the beginning, he said it before the war, he said it during the war, he said it since then, when he understands that Ukraine has the right to elect its own president or decide its own government, and to be integrated with Europe one way or the other, when he understands that, then the war is over. And then we can have an argument about where the border is, and what happens to Transnistria, and what happens to the various different territories. So that's when the war is over, and that's when we can have a real negotiation.
So now there is no real negotiation?
I'm afraid. I mean, obviously, I hope otherwise. But from what I hear in public, I don't hear it. I don't hear the Russians saying that they want to end the war. I don't hear them saying that they recognize that Zelensky is the president of Ukraine. I don't hear them. I don't hear them saying that. And the other thing I'm worried about the negotiation is that, of course, there are 2 negotiations. There's one about Russia, Ukraine and the territory, and then there's a second negotiation which is between America and Russia, and this is a series of business deals that are being discussed between Steve Witkoff and the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And this is not a secret. It's been written about in multiple newspapers. Witkoff himself has referred to it as something positive. But this is also for American politics something that's really unprecedented. That there should be that people around the president should have what seems to be or could be a kind of personal interest in how U.S. foreign policy comes out. That the interests of I have to be careful what I say because I can't but certainly having the business negotiation at the same time as a peace negotiation is peculiar. It's unprecedented. And that doesn't, to me, it doesn't bode well. I mean, what I fear is that, if the war ends when Putin understands that he can't win, I worry that the attitude of Trump is giving Putin the idea that he can keep fighting. That sooner or later he'll convince the Americans, to drop all their support for Ukraine and lift sanctions, that sooner or later, America will break from Europe. This is what he imagines. I mean, the one thing I think both Putin and Trump have not understood is first of all, the role that Europe is now playing. Europe now supplies Ukraine with 90% of its support. And secondly, they failed to understand what has happened in Ukraine in the last 4 years. Ukraine now has the most modern and the most sophisticated drone industry in the world, not comparable to anybody. It's technologically way advanced of now every European country in terms of what it can do. It's unquestionably now the strongest army in Europe. So much so that in the last few days, I'm sure you all have seen the story, that Zelensky has sent teams of experts to the Gulf to help the Emirates and others defend themselves against Iranian drones, because the Ukrainians have experience in how you do that. And the way you do it is not with very expensive American missiles, but with their drone interceptors and electronic warfare. And this is a transformation. Ukrainians now have agency. As the American president puts it, they have cards. And the end of the war, the outcome of the war, is not dependent on what Trump and Putin thinks. There are two other actors. One of them is Europe and one of them is Ukraine.
Why the Russian? How is it that Russian propaganda about Ukraine has gone global? How come? Are they so good, or we so weak?
I mean, those who recognize it aren't convinced by it. So I don't know that the fact that you can see it everywhere doesn't mean everybody believes it. But no, I mean, this is an influence campaign. It's been in the works for probably 20 years, starting in Ukraine itself. The Russian attempt to divide and weaken Ukraine goes back to the 1990s. It's involved very sophisticated efforts on, co-opting some journalists. Russian television stations were important for a while. There's a Russian media campaign. There's a covert campaign. I wrote about this in my book, Autocracy, Inc., in that book. The Russians will create websites in Spanish in places like Peru and Chile. The websites will look Spanish, they will look local. Actually, they'll be written in Moscow. They'll have some news about Peru, but really they'll also contain, information about the war in Ukraine or other issues that the Russians care about. So this involves fake websites, fake accounts, alternative media, journalism. It involves some companies, business attempts to use business connections to push narratives, and some politicians' support for pro-Russian political parties. And this is an enormous effort that goes a long time. They spend, hundreds of millions of euros on it. It's not a small part of what they do, because of course the Russians would much rather win the war through convincing, Europe to abandon Ukraine than by, fighting it. I mean, it's much more expensive to fight a war than it is to convince people to stop. And this goes back to the Soviet Union and even before that. I mean, this is a Russian way of thinking about warfare. Is you alter. It's called cognitive warfare. You alter the way your opponents think, and that convince them to give up or stop fighting. And so this is something. It's a very, very long-term project that's been built up over decades, and so we shouldn't be surprised to see it. I mean. I think actually a lot of people are now pretty resistant to it. I mean, younger people who I know are, if you're an internet native, if you grew up with it, you can often recognize propaganda better than people who didn't grow up with it. So I hope that it's less effective than it used to be.
You spoke in 2024 Peace Prize speech about the danger of false pacifism. You quoted Thomas Mann, who said pacifism that brings about war instead of banishing it. Orwell, pacifism is objectively pro-fascist, fascist. And your conclusion was that many of those in Germany and Europe who now call for pacifism in the face of Russian onslaught are indeed objectively pro-Russian. Now, the fear of war is not easy to overcome. How would you explain to those who try to overcome this fear that their desire for peace is a false pro-Russian pacifism?
So, if you want to if you believe really in peace, and you want peace in Europe, and you want Ukraine to be a stable, peaceful, and prosperous country that trades with its neighbors, in Romania and elsewhere, then you need to make sure that there's a government in Ukraine that has been created in the interests of the Ukrainians, and that it also is built to create prosperity in Ukraine. A Ukraine that is occupied by Russia, a Russia that would be then, enriched by Ukrainian assets and would be built on the excitement of having conquered another country. If you envision a Russian-occupied Ukraine, that would be a threat to Romania, a physical threat to Romania and to other countries, in the region, much greater, than even than you have today. And so you have to ask yourself, if you want long-term peace in Europe, if you want Romania to remain a sovereign country, then what you need to do is make sure that Russia doesn't conquer Ukraine and that Russia doesn't become then inspired to move farther, as it has done in the past. And if you're arguing that we shouldn't fight Russia and we should just let Russia win, which is sometimes the argument of people who call themselves pacifists, then first of all, you're arguing for a real murder and oppression and destruction of Ukraine. I mean, those of you who know, if you read about what's happened in the territories of occupied Ukraine, I've written about this and I've met people who come from there. I was actually in Kherson, which had been occupied and was then reconquered by the Ukrainians. I was there not that long after that happened. This occupation looks a lot like Nazi occupation. They came in to cities, they arrested anybody who looked suspicious, very often mayors, police chiefs, anybody who had authority in the community. Some of them have disappeared and never been seen again. They create filtration camps and other, kind of concentration camps for people who they suspect of being pro-Ukrainian or collaborators. They forbid people from speaking the Ukrainian language. This is something I spent a lot of time in Poland. My late father-in-law remembered a time when in German-occupied Poland when you were forbidden to speak Polish on the street. This is exactly the same in occupied Ukraine. You have, the removal of Ukrainian symbols. You're not allowed to talk about Ukrainian history and so on. So this is this is an occupied repressive state. And so if you're in favor of that, first of all, you're in favor of the repression of Ukrainians, and second of all, you're in favor of a situation in which your own country in Romania, if we're talking about Romanian pacifists, or Germany if you're in German, if you're talking about Germans, would then be much more threatened than it is now. So you have to ask, what is the motivation for people who don't want to fight the Russians? What are they really arguing for? They're arguing for the demise of their own countries, effectively. Not only the murder of and repression of Ukrainians, but they're arguing for what would be a huge security threat to Europe. So yes, I think it's a kind of false pacifism. As I said, I'll repeat it again. The war is over when the Russians stop fighting. When the Russians don't, when they give up this is an imperial colonial project. And when they give up this idea that they can colonize another country, then the war is over, as I said, and then we argue about where the border is.
Two more questions. How we can save democracy? And I like very much this idea you talk about.
It's too hard.
You talk about the opening of the last year's Salzburg Festival. Great. We save democracy by practicing it. Sounds very easy, but how can we do that?
So this was in the context of, I was talking about how a little bit about how Austrians tried to create democracy after World War II in this kind of wasteland that, you know, that they faced. And one of the ways they did it was through building brand new institutions, one of which was the Salzburg Music Festival.
And
right?
after the Russians left, yes.
Right. After, yes, they were in one part of Austria, yes. So that was later. But there was another part of Austria that was liberated after the Germans left. And this idea comes from the American, he wasn't American, sorry, the French philosopher de Tocqueville, who wrote a famous book called Democracy in America in the 19th century. And one of the things he observed about America was that in that time, this is, you know, not that long after American independence, was that Americans were very gifted at creating associations and organizations. And this was all kinds of things, you know, to build, and, you know, neighbors would help one another build a new house. They would create schools. They would create financial institutions. They would create social institutions. They would create clubs. And his argument was, and there's a quote he has, that wherever in France it would be built by, you know, by the king, and in England it would be something that would be done by some lord. You know, in America, this organization or institution or charity would be created by ordinary people. And this was one of his arguments about why democracy in America worked, was because people already worked inside institutions and they kind of practiced real democracy, meaning they learned how to compromise, and they argued, and they decided where to build the building or who should run the organization, and they decided these things at a very basic level. And that, you know, his argument was that it was this ground up kind of grassroots democracy that made democracy in America possible. There's another argument in recent years made by an American political scientist called Robert Putnam, who feared that it was exactly this layer of associations that was beginning to die in America. And this book is old, it's 20 years old now or something. And that the experience of working together was being lost. And in more recent years, we see people moving from being in real organizations to being part of kind of online mobs. And the experience of being online and clicking something that you like is not the same as the experience of going to build the community center and working with someone to construct it. And so there is an argument to be made, you know, if you want to look at the source of this, you know, attack on democracy in America now, you could argue that it is something deeper than just, you know, just social media. And you know, I suppose to answer your question, you know, people often put that question to me differently. They say, what can I do? You know, and the answer is, there isn't one answer. You know, the question of what you should do depends on who you are and what your talents are. You know, if you're a lawyer, you know, this is how I would answer it in America. If you're a lawyer, you should be part of one of the lawsuits that's seeking to, you know, stop the Trump administration from doing something illegal. If you're a doctor, you should be absolutely involved in trying to convey better health information. You know, you should be fighting this, you know, attack on vaccines, for example. You know, if you have the time and talent, you should be running for office at the lowest level in your community. You should be organizing the place where you live. You should be, you know, whatever is your local cause or interest. You know, if you think there should be a bridge across the river in your neighborhood, you should be part of the local committee who want to build the bridge. And so the argument is just in favor of being engaged in public life, which can be a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be clear politics. In fact, what Tocqueville was writing about wasn't necessarily political. And that through being engaged, then other opportunities open. And that you'll see, by doing something, you'll then see what else you can do. And that's the only, I mean, there are a lot of other answers you could do with the way our political systems are designed and so on, and the way the internet works, you know, but fundamentally, you know, being engaged in public life is part of what will create a healthy society. And so the more people who you can convince to do that, then the more likely you are to have a viable political system.
And maybe that's the reason why the communists hate this kind of association and so on.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
The last question is, do you like being a journalist?
Do I like being a journalist? Yeah.
Why?
I like talking to people and learning things. I like writing. I like putting together stories and arguments. I like trying to puzzle out complicated stories. I like meeting people. Being journalists, you're very lucky. I mean, they pay you to meet people and ask them questions. There are not that many jobs where you get to do that. So I still like it. I mean, I know that modern journalism is very flawed and very troubled, but I still like the practice of it. I mean, I still do reporting. I go places and try and learn about them. I just did a project in Washington that actually was very annoying and involved. It was to do with the woman who runs what's called the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and so on. And I did an investigation into her and how she runs the agency. And this involved a lot of numbers and fact checking, and I haven't done anything like that in a long time, but in the end it's also very satisfying, when you can present facts to people in a way that makes something happen.
And do you think that this new brave world ahead of us, the new democracies, still will need journalists?
So especially in a world where people are going to get more of their information online and where they're going to be asking AI chatbots to tell them things, you will still need someone to take the information from the real world and put it online. And so there's still going to be the question of how do you record and explain, what happened yesterday, because that's not online yet until someone puts it there. And so I don't know exactly how that function will be fulfilled. The role, the person who says what happened yesterday and puts it in a format that is then available to be searched or read, but someone will have to continue doing that, or these models and these chatbots will be useless to us. And so one way or another, the profession will continue.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. It's now time for Q&A. We have 30 minutes for that. I think we have mics in the room. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Please introduce yourself, and please prepare a short, sharp question. Thank you. And the mics are? Okay. Do you see the raised hand? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, you said that Putin wanted to make a point by showing that he can bully another country and get away with it. I was wondering if you could give us some examples post-World War II when a big country bullied another and got taxed as per the laws. So the laws were applied and they were maintained when such an abuse took place.
Okay, thank you. You understand the question? No. Maybe another version, or maybe in Romanian,
yes.
if it's okay?
If, unlike Putin, who attacked the Ukraine and wanted to show that the laws don't apply anymore, when were they applied in the past, in the 20th century or later, past World War II, when the laws were applied to an attacker, to a bully?
I think, so generally speaking, with some exceptions, if you look at the European continent, so peace was preserved after World War II because countries decided not to resolve their differences through attacking one another. And I should say, and Mark Carney said this in his speech as well, that the international law and the idea of, of an international community and the UN and so on, this was always aspirational. It was the thing that we aspired to. And often the United States and the Soviet Union and many other countries did not achieve it. But it nevertheless mattered. And so even the Soviet Union would try to pay lip service, as you say in English, to the law, and it would be offended if they sought to conform to it even when they didn't. But it's certainly in Western Europe, and then later after 1989 in all of Europe, the idea that we would, as I said, we would solve problems through diplomacy. We would not change borders without, without agreement. That borders were sacrosanct. I mean, there are some exceptions to that too, actually. But and that instead of fighting, we would use international institutions, the European Union or the OSCE or the UN, to resolve problems. I mean, I think Europe at least is an example of that. So. And the thing that is most worrying about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, starting in 2014, actually not in 2022, is that it was Putin was sending a message like, I don't care about your rules, never again, I don't care about the legacy of World War II, I'm gonna reestablish my empire in Europe if I want to.
Hello.
Just a moment, Mrudshan. Yes, please.
Hello. So for us, I mean, for my generation, the American dream is always there. We always wait for you guys, and it's a pleasure to have you here, ma'am. So please give us hope.
I don't represent America, yeah.
Oh, that's a pity, because we want America. I mean, I want it. My grandparents want it. So please give us hope. When you don't represent America, I understand, and tell us how you will American survive, how you will win this fight, and please tell us how will be the end, maybe. Thank you.
So I do not have a crystal ball, and I cannot predict the future. So I don't know how it ends. The only thing let me answer that by saying this. One of the really big mistakes we made in America, but also in Europe, in the 1990s, was to believe that democracy was now inevitable. That no matter what happened, we became democratic, and the story is over. And now we don't have to do anything. Now some people can make money, and some people can paint paintings, and some people can drive trucks, and they can do whatever they want, and this politics is something they don't have to care about, and politics is for a specialized class of people called politicians, and they can worry about it, and once every 4 years, maybe we vote. And that's, that was a mistake. There's nothing inevitable, that everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we do today. There's no such thing as like a historical inevitability. There's no reason why democracy has to fail, but also there's no reason why it has to succeed. And I think in America, maybe like here, but certainly in America, convincing people that this is true is what we have to do now. As an American, you have a role to play, and you might have to be a little bit more engaged than you've been in the past. You might have to pay attention more. You might have to vote, or even more than vote. As I said, you might have to play a role in a campaign or in a community organization, getting people to see that there is a danger is that this is what will determine what happens next. And I can see it happening. I mean, I see even some people around me who weren't interested in politics before are now, and I can see that happening. It's just a question of how far it goes and whether it's deep enough.
Ok, ne va trebui un microfon și aici. Nu știu unde sunt microfoanele acum în sală, dar vă rog.
Hi, thank you for coming to Timișoara, the city where the revolution started.
I know.
Let's start a new revolution for democracy, maybe. My question actually regards the post-truth era, the AI revolution, and maybe the power of the big tech. And I want to just stress something. So the 7 biggest tech companies in the US own about $20 trillion this year, like the capitalization, market capitalization, whilst Romania has 0.4. We had elections recently, and we've seen a bit of bullying from the big tech in the US, influencers from there calling our country undemocratic, and actually even if we start talking about manipulation of algorithms, it's also something coming from the big tech. How do we keep democracy in a world that we don't have any control over the platforms? And the DSA is being also bullied. You've mentioned it actually, that the European Union is being targeted by these platforms because we are the only one trying to regulate. So in all these contexts, how do we keep our democracy alive? Thank you.
So this is the hardest problem that there is. I mean, this exact question, because in practice, the tech companies now control so much of our political conversation. And there is I cannot give you an instant answer, or an easy answer. I mean, I do think that the EU can play a role through regulation, but ultimately, Europe is going to have its own technology and maybe its own platforms. There's also, just like there's nothing inevitable about politics, there's also no law that says that these 7 companies have to, won't rise and fall, won't lose some of their. I mean, we've seen social media platforms rise and disappear, depending on how people use them, and so ultimately, the job of creating alternative platforms, of getting, finding ways to have people converse and communicate online in ways that favor better conversation. And I've talked to, engineers and experts who are working on this and who think it's possible. Ultimately there will have to be alternative ways of communicating, and ultimately Europe needs its own tech industry. And so obviously that's not going to happen next week. But I've heard actually over the last few weeks and the last few months, I do hear more and more both European politicians and business people saying this. So the understanding that this is necessary, which I don't think was really there 2 or 3 years ago, seems to me that it's there now. But that ultimately is the answer. Again, I mean, even things like, if you want to have your own election laws. So some countries, I don't know the rules in Romania, so, some countries have rules about election spending. Some have rules about, Poland has a rule about how in the last 24 hours of the election, you can't do politics, you can't campaign. Countries set their own rules for how their campaigns should work, right? And they're allowed to do that. You can, it's your democracy, you make the rules. And the problem is that the tech platforms don't always feel obligated to obey by the rules. That is a huge problem for every democracy, actually, but it's notably a problem for European democracies. And so finding a way to make them adhere to the rules and make them more transparent so that it's clear how they work and how their algorithms work and how their funding works and payments and so on work, this is really fundamental to European democracy. So I would also say that in the absence of European tech companies, one of the things we definitely need is for the EU to enforce these rules about transparency. It is not censorship, and it is not against free speech to demand that Facebook or X or TikTok tell us why they're delivering particular material to us, or that they are asked to, to conform to the law like everybody else has to.
Vă rog.
How do you think that the war in Iran and maybe even possibly future action in Cuba will affect the war in Ukraine?
Let's leave Cuba to the side for the moment. Let's worry about Cuba when we get to Cuba. So first, I mean, clearly the war in Iran does represent a choice, okay? So in the first, this is from Zelensky has said this, in the first 3 days of the war in Iran, the Gulf states and maybe the US as well used up something like 800 Patriot anti-missile, Patriot ammunition missiles. Anti-missile missiles, I was about to say, but air defense missiles. This is more air defense than Ukraine has had since the beginning of the war. If Ukraine had had those missiles, they would not have lost their electricity and power this winter. And so, this is the choice to use that technology for this war of choice in Iran instead of defending Ukraine. I mean, I think this is another one of those signs to Putin that the United States is not is not fully on Ukraine's side, and it's another way of encouraging. Maybe even more importantly, obviously the high price of oil is very good for Russia because that's where all their money comes from. That's where their budget comes from. And the sanctions on Russia do hurt Russia, and they do harm the war effort, and they have weakened Russia's ability to strike Ukraine. And so if they are lifted, then which is apparently possible, that would also be that would be good for Russia. I mean, there is one caveat, which is that Russia has very close ties to Iran, and has had, the Iranians sent drones to Russia. The Shahid drones that they sent were then copied, and they're now being produced in Russia. They've had very close ideological ties and kind of, other kinds of ties. And, and the Russians do, when they see one of their fellow autocrats, being removed from office, or in this case murdered, this does, they perceive this as a weakening of their camp. I mean, they do think in terms of, it's not an alliance, at all, but they do think in terms of like the autocratic world that fights against the democratic world. Probably more so than any other dictatorship. They think in this group, we're part of this group. And so actually the removal of Maduro in Venezuela and the war in Iran do weaken Russia's sense of itself and its ability to project power. And there will be, I have to guess, but I'm pretty sure that there will be a part of the Russian security establishment and military establishment who sees both Iran and Venezuela as kind of blows to Russia and of undermining their role. Remember, a lot of they're very concerned about how they're perceived in the world, and how they want to be seen as a great power, and this also somehow weakens them. So there's this aspect as well. Their camp has been weakened. I think they'll see that. I mean, a lot depends on still what happens in Iran and who's in power when they stop fighting.
Un microfon și aici, vă rog, dacă sunt, sau unde sunt microfoanele?
Aici.
Da.
Hi, thank you so much for powerful insights. Very excited to have you here. I've been following you for a long time, and I couldn't believe that you're coming to Timișoara. I wanted to ask, if you will, to share us your take on the relationship between the decline of democracies and the undermining of women's rights. Because we see, for example, if we look at Hungary, since democracy started to decline, there have been less and less women in the parliament, until virtually no women in the parliament. In the United States, we saw with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, or with, people saying that we cannot have women as presidents because they're too emotional, but on the other hand, you have a president who takes decisions on a whim. And I feel like this is an important and you can see a pattern about it, but it doesn't necessarily come up as a main topic when we discuss about the decline of democracies.
So this is specifically about women's rights. No, so I actually think it's quite central. And I don't know what the debate looks like here, but actually in the US, this is part of the conversation, that there is a way in which certainly, at least in the United States, there is an element of the MAGA movement or Trumpism, whatever we're calling it, there's an element of that which is backlash against women. And there is if you read I've just read a very good book actually, which is a history of the ideas of the far right and how they even some academics, how they became more influential. And the language that they'd be using from the beginning is not just against women's rights, sometimes it's against women. I mean, it's very misogynistic. It's about disliking women and not wanting women in public life, and they're increasingly people who talk about women being, they shouldn't vote or they shouldn't be in politics and so on. And so there is an element of this backlash against it's not really about feminism. I mean, it's about the role that women play in the world. And there's also, in the US, a kind of backlash against the Me Too movement, if you remember that. So this feeling that, men should be able to do what they want and not be somehow shamed or, by women who they've attacked or harassed. And it's one of the drivers of certainly the young men who vote for it, and there's an attempt to appeal to them by appealing to some very juvenile ideas, and I think it's actually it's a part of their motivation and in some cases their appeal. So I don't think you're wrong to see that it's central. I think it's pretty fundamental, and it's part of why in the United States more and more you begin to have this very big difference in voting patterns between men and women. As women begin to perceive this movement as somehow inimical to them. I mean, historically, there was no gender difference in voting for Democrats and voting for Republicans. It was, there were women Republicans and men Democrats, and there was no difference. And that has begun to change, and it's part of this broader process. So no, I think this is a reactionary movement that sees the progress of women and the education of women and the rise of women in politics and public life as something that they have to push back against. And it's important to name it and understand that for what it is.
Okay. I am Brându Șarmanc. I'm a journalist. I'm working till March 31 in the studio of Free Europe, Romania. It will be closed in 10 days.
What will be closed in 10 days?
Radio Free Europe, yes. My question is, your family is, let's say, a coalition between an American journalist and a Polish politician. Do you contradict each other often about politics, about international situation?
So my husband is a separate element in international law. I don't speak for him. And obviously we agree about some things and we don't agree about other things. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Da, vă rog.
Hello. I was wondering, in your opinion, of course, what you think would be the moral take the European allies should have when asked to support the Iranian war. I mean, we've seen already various responses, varying from Romania to Spain, but what should be the more...
Un pic mai tare și un pic mai tare dacă se mai aude. No. So it's about NATO allies, of United States allies, right? And it's about Spain, who refused to permit United States to use the bases, but Romania did.
So the United States did not appeal to allies before the war. They didn't involve allies in the planning of the war. And so I don't think they can expect the allies to automatically cooperate with the war. And so I don't think there's a NATO policy on this war. It's not a NATO war. So it's up to each individual country to make their decision about what they want to do. I should say that, I understand why for Romanians who want to maintain the US bases in Romania, I understand why they would offer space. I don't know exactly, I don't know the details, what exactly they've offered to the US, but I can see why they would do that. I would just hope that they're asking for something in return.
Unde mai sunt microfon? Just one more. Yeah, just one more. Yes, please.
Hello, good evening. My name is Răzvan Zanfirescu. I'm very happy to listen to you live. For me, it's like a rock
Louder,
concert.
please, because we don't hear so good.
Okay, so can you hear me now? I can hear. Okay, so good evening, first of all. Secondly, my question is a little bit more complicated, I would say. Countries that are less free tend to have older leaders. In countries Freedom House is classified as not free, the median age of leaders is 69, while it's 61 in partly free countries and 58 in free countries. So there's a correlation. The less democratic country, the older the leadership. The median age gap between world leaders and their population is 32 years. That's a full generation of disconnect. We are here in a room full of young people. I'm 42 and I'm scared about this gap. And I think that we should try to do something in order not to lose democracy and to turn it against themselves, to bring these people, these young persons in the spotlight. How or what would be your advice on taking this challenge?
So this is why I like speaking at universities, because I agree with you completely. I think there should be more young people in politics. I think, particularly the generation of people who are now in their 20s and 30s, they're people who grew up with the internet, who understand the challenges better than people my age and certainly older. And I want to hear from them more. And it's not an accident that some of the most dynamic politicians in the world are younger. I mean, actually, the Ukrainian government, with some exceptions, for example, is very young. It's mostly people, it's not maybe in their 20s, but people in their 40s and younger. And that turned out to be necessary at a moment of when real dynamism and change was needed. So, maybe we can end on that note. I think that having young people be in politics, having them run for office, having them focus on trying to understand these hard problems that older people have failed to solve, I think this is great. So you should do it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. No, it was a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
We can conclude with something like make democracy great again, I hope. And Mrs. Applebaum will sign copies of her books, so you are invited in the lobby. Thank you.